Hey everybody, today I'm talking about 25 board games that are great for two players. Now all the games on this list are actually technically for more than two players, or you can play with more than two players. However, they do work as well, if not better, if you are playing with two players. So I understand that a lot of players always play with their significant others or one particular other person, so having a game that supports two players well is very, very important. If you're looking for a list of games that are exclusively for two players, then check out one of my other games or other lists that I've made, because I've made a couple of those videos. So in this list, or in this video, I'm going to talk about as I said, 25 games spanning from very light, simple games up to heavier, more involved games, but most of the games are kind of around that medium weight level. So let's get started with the lighter games. So the lightest game I've got on this list is definitely Kyriba. Now Kyriba is a very small card game, as you can probably see from the box, by Reiner Knizia, who's a great designer. This one, if you're playing with more than two players, it's quite a random and chaotic game where you are playing cards consisting of these different animals numbered from 1 to 8, and as soon as you play a third card or more of a particular animal, then it will basically eat the pile of cards of the animal lower than it in the food chain, and then you'll get all those cards as points. But when you're playing as a two-player game, the game becomes quite a tense head-to-head battle, as you are being very careful about which cards to play at certain times, because you can leave openings for your opponent. But very good, very tense, and extremely quick as well, and it's a lot of fun. So that's Kyriba. I'll try to rattle through these games quickly because I understand there's quite a lot to get through. So the second really light game I have is Coloretto. Now Coloretto is quite a popular, kind of a pushy luck set collection game, as you're playing cards onto these different hops or these columns, and you're basically trying to collect 3 different colours of chameleons to get loads of points at the end of the game, and for every kind of set you've got above those 3 you're trying to collect is going to count as negative points. The game slightly changes when you're playing with two players, because instead of having kind of a certain amount of columns that you can play 4 cards in, or 3 cards in, I forget, this one you're actually limited to either 1, 2 or 3 cards depending on the column you play on. And it's a game about kind of, as I said, pushing your luck, trying not to leave your opponent something very inviting to take, but also trying to get as much as you can out of your turn. So a really great, fun, fast set collection game that is Coloretto. Next I have probably a bit more of a niche game with Game of Thrones, Hand of the King. This is a bit more like Kyriba in the fact that you are trying to, well, basically when you're playing with more than two players it becomes a bit more chaotic and you are a bit more subject to, a bit of luck, whereas in two players it's extremely tactical, as you are trying to basically move a character up and down these different rows and columns to collect different family members to get the majorities of them. But this one, kind of leaving your opponents in a position where they can't capitalize as much as they'd like to, is very, very important. And at two players that kind of shines through a lot stronger than at the other player count. So a really great one for two players as well, particularly if you like Game of Thrones. The fourth game I'm going to talk about on my light category is Sagrada. I don't have Sagrada anymore myself, but this is a really fun dice drafting game, as you are basically choosing a dice from a communal pool, and you are basically allocating it to your stained glass window, trying to make different patterns of not only the colours but of the pip values as well. The game scales extremely well, obviously doing well at two players as well, because the pool of dice you're drafting from becomes smaller and smaller. Again, the downtime is completely eradicated in a two-player game, because the turns just go extremely quickly, and you can probably get a game of this done in 20 minutes. Very fun, very puzzly, and a very beautiful game as well. So that concludes my light games on the list. Okay, so let's talk about some medium light games. So these are the games that are still relatively simple to understand, but just have that dash more of strategy or tactics that you need to do well in the game. So let's get started with Kashgar, Merchants of the Silk Road. Now this is a game that is not often talked about, but it's a very tight, very very sharp game that basically you are building these different columns or caravans of cards, and you're choosing kind of the first card in each of those columns to play at a time. And when you're ever choosing a card, you're basically moving the one you've just played to the back of the caravan. And it's an engine building style game as you're trying to basically activate all these different cards to collect different spices and donkeys and gold in order to fulfill these different contracts. And basically the objective of the game is to try and be the first player to fulfill 25 points worth of contracts. It's very good. The game can kind of embed different kind of levels of player interaction, because there's a few cards you can add in to kind of add more conflict into the game and stuff like that. But it's a really great game that really doesn't really matter if or what the player count is. So if it's 2 players, it's not going to change whether it's 2, 3 or 4 players. It's still going to play fast and fun. It's a really great game. That is Kashgar Merchants of the Silk Road. Next I have Arboretum. Arboretum is, despite its very nice look and the nature theme, it's a very cutthroat card game as you are trying to build up this map of different types of trees, and you're trying to create these different routes or paths of trees by basically putting numbers in ascending orders. But there's a really cool twist to the game where once you've kind of built your arboretum of trees, the cards you've got left in your hand are very important, because the player with the highest number of a certain type of tree in their hand is going to be the only player who scores that type of tree. And when it's a 2-player game, you can very clearly see what your opponent's going for, and you can be quite nasty and try and keep those cards in your hand to ensure that your opponent isn't going to score those types of trees. But a really great game, particularly at 2 players. That is Arboretum. Next I have Disney Villainous. Now this is a game with huge appeal in terms, if you like the Disney theme. This one you are basically taking the role of all the different villains from the Disney series or the Disney films. And every character is very unique and has unique kind of winning objectives. And you are trying to activate these different action spots to play cards and in order to try and fulfill your objectives. Loads of variability here, and I think with a 2-player game it's a lot easier to wrap your head around what your opponent's trying to do, which can be a bit more difficult when you're playing at the higher player counts, because as I said, the different characters are so wildly different, and kind of keeping track of everything can be quite difficult. But with 2 players it works really well. Artwork's great, and it's a great production and very accessible. So that's Disney Villainous. Next I have Letters from Whitechapel. Now from Disney to Jack the Ripper, so quite a jump in themes there. But this one is a very interesting game that's technically a 1 versus many style game. So usually you'd have one person playing Jack the Ripper and one or a bunch of people playing all the different police officers trying to catch Jack the Ripper. But at a 2-player game, obviously one person's playing Jack and one person's playing all the police officers, which makes a lot more kind of a head-to-head battle of minds kind of game. The downtime of the game is completely gone when you're playing 2 players, because you're not having to discuss and basically plan your plan of action out with the other players. You're simply taking control of all the officers. And as I said, it's a hidden movement game, so Jack can move a certain amount of spots, and you're trying to basically pin him into a corner if you're the police officers and ultimately arrest him. But a really fantastic streamlined game that is just really good at 2 players. Very tense as well. Next I have Marvel Legendary. Now this is actually one of the expansion boxes, because I've got all the content for Legendary. And there's a lot of it, but this one is obviously a Marvel comic themed deck building game. So this one is a cooperative game, or technically a semi-cooperative game, where you have all the different superheroes from the Marvel universe, and you are trying to basically use all your different powers to overcome a certain scheme and defeat a different mastermind. And you've got all the masterminds from the comics. So much material for this one. And when you're playing with 2 players, again, the downtime is completely, shed, and also you can really kind of focus your strategies to synergize with each other. One person might really focus on, hitting the mastermind hard, while the others focusing on keeping all the villains out of the city. It's a great game, and again, if you want replayability, this one just has a ton of it. There's so much content to explore, loads of different schemes, loads of different masterminds, and when you're playing with 2 players, you can really get a game of this done pretty quickly. So a fantastic deck builder, that is Marvel Legendary. Next, I have a couple of games that are quite similar to each other, and again, more cooperative games, because I find cooperative games work really well with 2 players, because you can work together a bit more harmoniously and not have to worry about everybody's opinion or everybody's 2 cents to put in. But this one is Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective. This is a game where you're trying to solve a murder mystery by looking through kind of an address directory and kind of a scenario book. You're going around London visiting all different people, trying to get clues, and ultimately trying to solve who committed the murder or who committed the crime. Pretty difficult, can be quite out there in terms of the theories, who's done it in the end. You can jump to some quite wild conclusions, but it's a lot of fun and a great evening activity, especially if you're playing with 2 players. Next, I have kind of a modern version of Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective. This is the Chronicles of Crime. This one is, again, you're trying to solve murder mysteries and stuff, but this one uses an app where all the kind of components in the game have a QR code assigned to them, and when you want to talk to a certain character, you scan in the QR code. If you want to talk to them about a certain piece of evidence, you can scan in that evidence, and it's a very clever system, one with just infinite kind of possibilities and potential. And there's quite a bit of expansion content for this one as well, and also there is kind of player-based scenarios and stuff where people can kind of create their own scenarios and stuff, which you can explore. A really great game, fantastic artwork and stuff, and very immersive as well. Sometimes you're going to crime scenes and you can put on your kind of 3D glasses and have a look around the crime scene to try and find all the evidence. Really great fun, and when you're playing 2 players, you're involved at all times. So some great games there. Some other games I want to talk about are Citrus. Citrus is actually a tile placement area control game. Area control games normally don't work very well for 2 players, but weirdly enough, Citrus works extremely well for 2 players, as you are picking up different tiles, laying them down, trying to control these different thinkers on the board by kind of leading your tiles up or kind of connecting your tiles and stuff, trying to get loads of victory points. Fantastic for 2 players. That's Citrus. Also, a bit of a strange out-of-the-box one is Ra, which is a classic auction game by Reiner Knizia. Again, auction games normally don't work very well for 2 players at all. However, this one works very well as you have a kind of a pre-assigned bunch of auction tokens, and you are using them to bid on different tiles, which score you points in lots of different ways. But the tension in a 2-player game is great, because you've got to be very, very careful about what you bid, because what the previous bid was is what you're going to be taking into your hand for the next round. So you've got to be very careful about how you weigh up those bids. But a great game that works well at all player counts, and one that really stood the test of time. And I believe that concludes my medium lightweight games. So let's talk about some medium weight games. Okay, so let's talk about some medium weight games. I'm going to start with Concordia. Now, Concordia, I think, is one of the best games ever made, full stop. Unfortunately, it works extremely well at 2 players. You can also buy some map packs as well to play on a tighter map, which really does increase the kind of the player tension and interaction, particularly if you are playing for 2 players. You are basically trying to play through a hand of cards in order to collect resources, buy new cards, to lay different kind of trade houses across the map, basically all in order to try and score victory points, because the way the game scores is quite unique, because you have certain different or a bunch of different objectives which are all assigned to the card you're actually playing, because every card has a god assigned to it, and those gods are basically multipliers depending on certain criteria you fulfilled throughout the game. So, for example, you might score for every Saturn card, you might score a point for every different region you're in on the board. And then if you collect more Saturn cards, you're going to score 2 points or 3 points or 4 points for every region. So there's lots of different things to try, lots of different routes to go down. And with 2 players, again, works extremely well, because the downtime is just gone. And if you're playing on those tight maps, then you still got that tight player interaction you have with the higher player counts as well. So one that really isn't affected by playing at 2 players and works equally as well. Next I have Marco Polo, and that can be either the original Voyages of Marco Polo or this one I have here, which is Marco Polo 2. This one is a worker placement style game that uses dice, as you are rolling a bunch of dice at the start of the game and you're assigning them to different actions on the board, collecting resources, fulfilling contracts, travelling around the map. Everybody has a unique player power in this one, which can be very, very powerful and give you distinct advantages. Plays extremely quickly with 2-player games. I mean, it's not even a long game with 3 or 4 players, but with 2 players it works great. The map is made, or the actions are made slightly tighter, but overall it is generally a looser game with 2 players, so it's a bit more forgiving, but still it works very, very well. That is Marco Polo 1 or 2. Next I have Newton, which I think is a bit of a hidden gem of a game. Hadn't really got the kind of buzz that I thought it would, but it's a fantastic game, as you have a hand of cards and you are basically choosing a bunch of cards that you're going to play each round, and each of those cards have a different kind of action assigned to them, such as traveling around a map, trying to visit different kind of locations and universities. You're trying to collect knowledge for your bookshelf, which is going to be actually how you get points in the first place. You're going to be collecting money, collecting new cards into your hand, but I guess overall it's quite a multiplayer solitaire style game, hence why it works well at 2 players. There is some kind of passive player interaction as you're fighting over the cards you want, and when you visit certain spaces first, you might get like a bonus tile or something. But a really great game, again, that plays very quickly with 2 players, and yeah, no hindrance at all, or no negative by playing this 2, 3 or 4 players. You're still going to get the same experience and not have to sacrifice any of the fun. Next I have Grand Austria Hotel. Now this is one of the games that really sprung to mind when making this list, because this one really does sing at 2 players, and that is because the way the player order works, or the turn order works, is quite unique in the fact that it snakes. So it'll be player 1, player 2, player 3, player 3, player 2, player 1, and obviously when you're playing 4 players, that means the person who goes first is going to have to wait quite a long time before he takes his turn again. However, in a 2-player game, you've only got to wait for one other person, which is great. This is a fantastic engine building and drafting style game, as you are rolling a bunch of dice which are assigned to different actions, and then picking the action you want. The more dice that are there, which means the more powerful actions you're going to take, but obviously if the fewer dice that are there means that you're going to take the rarer actions that aren't readily available. You are basically playing staff cards, you are trying to feed your guests and send them off to their rooms to get victory points and synergies and bonuses and stuff like that. But one of my favourite games, and one that is just fantastic at 2 players, that is Grand Austria Hotel. Next I have the Castles of Burgundy. This one is a massively successful Euro style game, where you are again rolling dice and using those dice to collect tiles from a central board and place them on your own individual board, trying to score victory points in lots of different ways. Another game with lots of synergies and stuff. This one works well at 2 players, not only because it makes it so much quicker, but the game scales very well as well, because basically each region you're drafting these tiles from is either, the tiles that you can take from those areas is varied depending on the player count. So if there's 4 players, I think there's 4 tiles in each region, and if there's 2 players, there's only 2. So the game stays equally as tight no matter what player count it is, and you can really get through a game of this quickly. Great game by Stefan Feld. Next I have Signorie, another dice drafting game, one that scales well because again the pool of dice is made smaller depending on the player count. This one you are trying to basically send your sons or train your sons up in different disciplines, send them off to different noble families to get victory points, marry your daughters off to different noble families. It has a great little engine building or individual player board, as when you draft certain dice or die, you can basically trigger a lot of different actions that you've invested in previously. Really great, lots to think about. Probably the heaviest game in this bracket of games, but a really great one if you want something that's going to kind of pull you in a lot of different directions and have to kind of force you to balance a lot of different things while still being relatively easy to digest. That is Signorie. And finally, for this section of games, I have Orléans. This is a bag building game, so a bit like deck building, where you're trying to basically spend cards to buy new powerful cards and add them to your hand and keep going kind of cycling. This one, you are basically have a bag of different tokens, and you're using those tokens to lay on your player board. And when you're taking certain actions, you're taking more tokens and adding them to your bag, trying to get more and more powerful combinations. Ultimately, you're trying to climb all these different tracks, trying to get multipliers by traveling a map. But again, a lot like games like Newton, this one is relatively multiplayer solitaire. So again, not a lot of player interaction. Just there's just a bit of attention on taking the buildings that you want, because you can kind of buy new buildings that are only available to you. You want to be the first to take these different multiplier tokens, which are at the top of kind of different tracks. So yeah, still enough player interaction to keep it interesting, but one that means that you can play at either player count and still have the exact same experience, which is fantastic. So that concludes my medium bracket of games. So let's go on something a little bit heavier. Okay, so I've only got a couple of medium heavyweight games to talk about, but the first one is another Stefan Feld game with Trajan. Trajan, one of my top 3 games of all time, and again, fortunately, it works extremely well for 2 players, because basically the length of a round or a turn in the game is varied depending on the player count. So it's scaled quite well that way. The map is made slightly tighter when it's 2 players. However, the rest of the game is still a bit looser than it would normally be, but that doesn't really matter as well, because the points just reflect that, but the tension remains the same. So this is quite a brain burner game in terms of what you actually do on your turn, because you have an individual player board with a rondel of different actions on, and you're basically using this Mancala mechanism where you're picking up these different tokens and moving them around kind of all these different action spaces one at a time, dropping off a token on each one, and whichever one you land on is the action you get to take. But you haven't only got to consider the action you take, you are trying to line up the different colours of the tokens as well, because you can get bonus actions depending on different tiles you have on your unique player board. It's what we call a point salad game. There's a lot of things going on and just loads and loads of different ways to get points, but it's so satisfying. You can really do well at this one. If you really do plan your turns ahead and think carefully about what you want to do, you can line up 3, 4, 5 turns in advance, which can be extremely satisfying when it really does come off. So one that I think it is a next level game, but I think anybody can appreciate this one. It's just brilliant. It is just a masterpiece of design, and if you do want to take that next step of gaming and really do want to push your limits, give Trajan a try, because it is fantastic without being too much as well. So the second game I want to talk about is Troyes. Troyes is it's a dice drafting game, but it's a bit different. It's quite a strange feeling game, because you have a bunch of dice that you're rolling on your turn, which is going to you're going to allocate to different workers and stuff, which give you different actions, which ultimately you're going to try and turn into victory points. But in this one, not only the dice you're rolling are accessible to you, you can actually take dice belonging to other people or other players without their permission. You just simply got to pay them a bit of money, depending on how many dice you're taking from them. Now, you might think with a 2-player game that's going to be a bit too in your face, and it is. I mean, it's not a game for the faint of heart. You've got to expect to have your turns really messed with. But in this one, the 2-player game is varied slightly in the fact that you've got a neutral player as well, which you can draft dice from. So there's a bit of mitigation there to make it not so in your face and have your turns completely messed with. But it's a great game, one that you've got to, as I said, use those different cards to your advantage, but also have to almost work together to try and fight the different threats that are attacking the medieval city of Troyes. Really great. I mean, it's got a kind of a subjective art style that some people might like, some people might hate. I personally really like it, but it's a great game with a ton of replayability as well. So if you want to get your teeth sunk into a game that you can try again and again and again and get better and better and better at with one particular person, then Troyes is really one to try, because there is so many different cards to play and each game is going to be very, very different. So that concludes my medium heavyweight games. Let's go into the real heavy stuff. Okay, so only a couple of games to talk about here on my heavy list. So these are the ones that are for your more advanced players, ones that are going to really reward repeated plays. Lots of rules, lots of things to kind of think about, lots of things lots of plates to spin at the same time. So first game I want to talk about is, believe it or not, another dice drafting game. This is Trismegistus. This one is so good. However, it's not for everybody because there is a lot going on. As you can tell by the theme of the game, it's about alchemy. You are trying to basically collect all these different chemical materials and try and make all these different experiments or formulas. The kind of chain reaction of things you can do, the engine building you can do is really interesting. When you your turn consists of drafting a dice basically, but there's so much things you're thinking about when you are drafting that die, such as the color, the symbol, and the amount of dice in that pool in the first place. Lots of things you can do, loads of ways to get points. And you can piggyback other players' actions as well. So when it's not your turn, you have these tokens that you can trade in to kind of piggyback off what the other player is doing, which can be really great. This one is by one of my favourite designers, actually, Danio Toscini. This one is by far his heaviest game. But if you like other games that he's made, such as Teotihuacan or Sulcan or stuff like that, this one is a nice next level game to go to. People have some issues with the way the game looks in terms of small kind of graphic design issues. I never had that problem myself. I think it's fantastic. One of my favourite games, but one not for the faint-hearted. But again, if you want a game that's very heavy for 2 players, give this one a go. Next, I have Maracaibo by Alexander Pfister. Alexander Pfister, another really popular game designer. This one is a bit of a combination of all his other designs. Games such as Mombasa, Great Western Trail, Blackout Hong Kong. This one is, I almost consider his magnus opus. I think it's a fantastic game as you are sailing around the Caribbean Sea, trying to complete different quests, trying to use helpers that you've recruited, trying to gain influence with the different nations. It almost has this kind of stock market style mechanism as you are trying to, again, increase your favour with those different nations by fighting for them. Just loads of things you can do. It has a multiple use card system where, there's loads of information on each of the cards and you can kind of choose how to use them, but obviously if you're using them for one thing, you're going to have to sacrifice it for another. Still a lot going on in this game, but it's really great. And the game also comes with somewhat of a campaign as well. So in fact, I can't really recall any kind of heavier Euro style games like this that have a story element to them, and this one actually does quite a good job of that. So as you play the game, there's going to be a very light story which can kind of modify certain areas on the board and stuff like that. But it's really great fun, and again, with 2 players, you're going to get the whole experience and not have to sacrifice anything. So a really great game, and by far Pfister's best game for me. That is Maracaibo. And the final game I'm going to talk about on this video is Through the Ages, A New Story of Civilization. This one is, as you tell by the name, it's a civilization building game as you are trying to build your own nation up from scratch, basically starting from very primitive tools, primitive technology, and developing into more advanced soldiers, more advanced science, and new political systems and stuff. Loads and loads of cards, loads of strategies to go down, lots of paths, lots of synergies, and again, one of those games that's going to reward repeated plays because you're going to become more and more familiar with the cards, which means you can kind of tinker your strategy because you know what's coming up rather than just hoping that it goes your way. But a great game. One, I said, it's going to be really good if you play it with a particular person again and again and again, because if you're constantly introducing it to new players, the rules burden can be somewhat of an obstacle to overcome. But again, if you're both familiar with the rules, you can pretty much get through a game of this quite quickly, as opposed to the 3, 4, 5 hours it would take if you're playing it from scratch. But yeah, a really great game, one that is difficult to get to the table unless you're both quite invested in it. But if you are, you're going to get a lot of dividends from it because it is a fantastic experience, and I highly do recommend it. So that concludes this video of my of some great games that are really fantastic for 2 players. Hopefully there's something on here that's piqued your interest. If there is, you can check out my unique videos I've made for each of these, because I should have done a review for almost every game on this list. There might be a couple of exceptions where you can obviously get some more details about how the game feels and how it plays and my personal thoughts on it. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, please hit like and subscribe to my channel. You can also check out my other videos too. Alternatively, you can support me by following me on Instagram and backing me on Patreon as well. I'll leave the links below for those ones. But for everyone else, I'll see you next time on Chairman of the Board. Bye.